Throughout America's history, African Americans have faced brutal violence and debilitating legislation that is usually a response to Black prosperity. This video will explore its political, social, and economic impact, and how it ultimately led to the Civil War. The antebellum era, spanning from the end of the War of 1812 to the start of the Civil War in 1861, was a period of profound transformation in American history. The antebellum era was marked by a significant expansion in agriculture, particularly in the southern states. The invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in 1793 revolutionized the cotton industry, making the process of separating cotton fibers from seeds much more efficient. This innovation greatly increased the profitability of cotton production and led to a boom in the cotton economy. Southern planters expanded their plantations and sought new lands to cultivate, leading to the westward expansion of agriculture. Cotton quickly became the dominant crop in the South, earning the region the nickname King Cotton. The demand for cotton in both the domestic and international markets fueled the growth of the Southern economy. By the mid-19th century, the United States was producing the majority of the world's cotton supply, which was in high demand by textile mills in Britain and the northern states. This economic dependency on cotton had profound social and political implications, particularly concerning the institution of slavery. The expansion of the cotton economy was inextricably linked to the growth of the plantation system and the entrenchment of slavery in the southern states. As cotton production increased, so did the demand for slave labor. Enslaved African Americans were forced to work on plantations under brutal conditions, providing the labor necessary to sustain the cotton economy. The profitability of slavery for Southern planters reinforced the social and economic structures of the South, generating a rigid class system based on race and economic status. The reliance on slavery had significant consequences for the Southern economy. While it generated immense wealth for plantation owners, it also created an economy that was highly dependent on a single crop and resistant to industrialization. The dependence on slavery and agriculture contributed to the economic and social isolation of the South from the rapidly industrializing North. In contrast to the agricultural South, the northern states experienced rapid industrialization during the antebellum era. The early 19th century saw the rise of factories, particularly in New England, where textile mills harnessed the power of rivers to operate machinery. The development of industries such as textiles, ironworks, and machinery production transformed the northern economy, making it more diverse and dynamic. The market revolution was a key component in northern economic growth. The period saw a shift from a subsistence economy to a market-oriented economy, where goods were produced for sale rather than for personal use. Improvements in transportation, such as the construction of the Erie Canal and the expansion of the railroad network, facilitated the movement of goods and people across the country. Innovations in communication, like the telegraph, further connected the expanding markets. The rise of a market economy in the North created new opportunities for entrepreneurs and workers, leading to the growth of cities and a burgeoning middle class. However, it also brought about social changes, including labor disputes and the rise of a working class consciousness. The economic divergence between the industrial North and the agrarian South set the stage for the political conflicts that would later erupt into the Civil War. The antebellum era saw the entrenchment of slavery as a foundational institution in the southern states. The expansion of the cotton economy and the resulting demand for labor led to the growth of the enslaved population. By the mid-19th century, there were nearly 4 million enslaved African Americans in the United States, the vast majority of whom lived in the South. The conditions of slavery were harsh and dehumanizing. Enslaved people were subjected to physical violence, family separations, and a lack of legal rights. They worked long hours in the fields, performing grueling labor under the supervision of overseers. Despite these oppressive conditions, enslaved African Americans developed rich cultural traditions and forms of resistance, including the creation of kinship networks, religious practices, and acts of defiance against their enslavers. In the North, the abolitionist movement gained momentum during the antebellum era. Abolitionists sought to end the institution of slavery and promote racial equality. The movement was diverse, including both Black and white activists, who used a variety of tactics to advocate for emancipation. Prominent figures in the abolitionist movement included Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Tubman. William Lloyd Garrison, the editor of the abolitionist newspaper The Liberator, called for the immediate and unconditional end of slavery. Abolitionists used a range of strategies to raise awareness and push for change. They organized lectures, published newspapers and pamphlets, and held public meetings. The abolitionist movement faced significant opposition, including violent attacks and legal restrictions, but it succeeded in bringing the issue of slavery to the forefront of national consciousness. The political landscape of the antebellum era was marked by growing sectional tensions between the North and the South. primarily over the issue of slavery. As new territories were acquired and states were admitted to the Union, the question of whether they would be free or slave states became increasingly contentious. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was an early attempt to address this issue. It allowed Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state and Maine as a free state, maintaining the balance between free and slave states in the Senate. The compromise also prohibited slavery in the Louisiana Territory north of the 3630 parallel. While it temporarily eased tensions, the Missouri Compromise was a stopgap measure that did not resolve the underlying conflict. As the United States continued to expand westward, the question of slavery in new territories remained a contentious issue. The Compromise of 1850 was another attempt to address sectional tensions. This complex package of legislation admitted California as a free state, allowed the territories of New Mexico and Utah to decide the issue of slavery through popular sovereignty, and included a stricter Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act required that escaped enslaved people be returned to their enslavers, even if they were found in free states. This law was highly controversial and galvanized abolitionist sentiment in the North. Many northern states passed personal liberty laws to counteract the Fugitive Slave Act, further heightening sectional tensions. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, introduced by Senator Stephen A. Douglas, allowed the territories of Kansas and Nebraska to decide the issue of slavery through popular sovereignty. This effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise's prohibition of slavery north of the previously agreed-upon parallel. This act led to violent conflicts between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers in Kansas, a period known as Bleeding Kansas, for compromises to resolve the issue of slavery. The violence and political turmoil in Kansas further polarized the nation and demonstrated the potential for conflict to erupt over the issue of slavery. In 1857, the Supreme Court's decision in Dred Scott v. Sanford further inflamed sectional tensions. Dred Scott, an enslaved African American, had sued for his freedom on the grounds that he had lived in free territories. The court ruled that Scott was not a citizen and therefore had no standing to sue in federal court. Moreover, the court declared that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories, effectively nullifying the Missouri Compromise. The Dred Scott decision was met with outrage in the North and celebration in the South. It deepened the divisions between free and slave states and underscored the inability of the existing political system to resolve the issue of slavery. The antebellum era was also a period of significant immigration and urbanization. Millions of immigrants, particularly from Ireland and Germany, arrived in the United States during the mid-19th century. These immigrants sought economic opportunities and refuge from political and religious persecution in their home countries. The influx of immigrants contributed to the rapid growth of American cities. Urban centers like New York, Boston, and Chicago expanded dramatically, driven by industrialization and the need for labor. Immigrants often faced difficult living conditions, including overcrowded housing and poor sanitation, but they also formed vibrant communities and contributed to the cultural diversity of American society. Immigration also sparked nativist reactions, as some native-born Americans feared competition for jobs and cultural changes. The Know Nothing Party, a political movement characterized by its anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic stance, gained influence in the 1850s. Despite these challenges, immigrants played a crucial role in the economic and social development of the United States during the antebellum era. Want good luck for the next 5 years? Share this video with 5 people. The political landscape of the antebellum era saw the rise and fall of several political parties. The Republican Party, founded in 1854, was primarily composed of former Whigs, Free Soilers, and anti-slavery Democrats. The party opposed the expansion of slavery into the Western territories and promoted a platform of free labor, industrial development, and economic modernization. The rise of the Republican Party reflected the growing sectional divide in American politics. The election of 1860 was a turning point in American history. Abraham Lincoln, the Republican candidate, won the presidency on a platform of preventing the expansion of slavery. His election was unacceptable to many Southern states, which saw it as a direct threat to their way of life and economic interests. Lincoln's victory led to the succession of several Southern states and the eventual outbreak of the Civil War. The antebellum era also witnessed the rise of popular culture and new forms of entertainment. Minstrel shows, which feature white performers in blackface, became a popular form of entertainment, reflecting and reinforcing racial stereotypes. While deeply problematic and offensive, minstrel shows were a significant part of the cultural landscape of the time. Minstrel shows, a dark chapter in the annals of American entertainment, reveal much about the country's tortured soul and its pathological obsession with race. Emerging in the early 19th century, these spectacles of degradation laid bare the nation's deep-seated prejudices and its relentless drive to dehumanize the black body. Minstrel shows did not simply materialize from the ether. They were born of a society steeped in white supremacy. In the 1830s, as the specter of slavery loomed large, white performers began donning blackface, grotesquely exaggerating African American features and mannerisms. The infamous Jim Crow, concocted by Thomas Dartmouth "Daddy" Rice, set the stage for what would become a pernicious form of entertainment. The minstrel show was a carefully orchestrated ritual of humiliation, divided into three parts: the opening, the olio, and the afterpiece. The opening saw the performers, arrayed in a mocking semicircle, sang and danced, with the smug master of ceremonies flanked by Mr. Tambo and Mr. Bones, who embodied the coarse and the clownish. The second part, or the olio segment, paraded a variety of acts, from crude comedic skits to parodies, all steeped in the stench of racial denigration. The finale, or afterpiece, often set on an idyllic plantation, was a longer skit designed to perpetuate the myth of the contented slave, happy in his bondage. At the heart of these shows were vicious stereotypes that painted African Americans as lazy, ignorant, and buffoonish. The blackface white actors would portray black people as grotesque caricatures that sought to affirm the audience's sense of racial superiority. Minstrel shows were not a marginal phenomenon. They were a cultural juggernaut, seducing white audiences across the North and South. They embedded themselves in the American psyche, influencing vaudeville, musical theater, and even early cinema. The poisonous stereotypes they propagated lingered long after the last minstrel show ended. Minstrel shows are a stark reminder of America's racial pathology. They reveal a society that found pleasure in the degradation of black people, a society that constructed an entertainment empire on the foundations of bigotry and hatred. They are a mirror held up to the nation's soul, reflecting the ugly truths that it would rather forget. But it is in remembering and confronting these dark corners of our history that we begin to understand the depths of our wounds and the long road to healing. Consider becoming a member of our team. Just click the join button. All your support helps us continue to take deep dives into Black culture and history. The antebellum era was also a period of significant cultural development in American literature and art, led by figures like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. It emphasized individualism, self-reliance, and a connection with nature. Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, and Edgar Allan Poe were among the prominent authors of the period, contributing to a rich literary tradition that explored themes of morality, identity, and the human condition. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, had a profound impact on public opinion about slavery, galvanizing anti-slavery sentiment in the North and provoking outrage in the South. The development of American music also took new forms during the antebellum era. Spirituals and folk songs created by enslaved African Americans expressed their experiences, hopes, and resistance. These musical traditions would later influence the development of blues, jazz, and other genres of American music. This era also saw a religious movement. The Second Great Awakening, a Protestant religious revival movement, swept through the United States during the antebellum era. The revival emphasized personal salvation, emotional religious experiences, and social reform. Camp meetings and revivalist preachers attracted large crowds, inspiring a wave of religious enthusiasm and moral reform. The revival played a crucial role in the abolitionist movement, as many religious leaders and laypeople viewed slavery as a moral evil that needed to be eradicated. The connection between religious revival and social reform underscored the moral and ethical dimensions of the antebellum debates over slavery and other social issues. The Second Great Awakening had a profound impact on American society, leading to the rise of various social reform movements. The temperance movement, which sought to reduce alcohol consumption, gained significant support. Education reform, led by figures like Horace Mann, aimed to establish public schools and improve educational opportunities for all children. The economic and social divisions between the North and the South were stark and growing during the antebellum era. The North's economy was characterized by industrialization, urbanization, and a more diverse labor force, including immigrants and free laborers. In contrast, the South remained predominantly agrarian, with an economy heavily dependent on slavery and the production of cotton. These economic differences were accompanied by distinct social structures and cultural values. The North's growing middle class, urban professionals, and industrial workers contrasted with the South's rigid class hierarchy based on plantation agriculture and the institution of slavery. These divergent economic and social systems contributed to mutual misunderstandings and mistrust between the regions. The political landscape of the antebellum era was increasingly polarized by the issue of slavery. Legislative compromises, such as the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850, were temporary solutions that failed to address the deeper conflict over the expansion of slavery into new territories. The Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Dred Scott decision further exacerbated sectional tensions, as both sides saw their core interests and values threatened. The rise of the Republican Party, with its platform opposing the expansion of slavery, represented a direct challenge to Southern political power. The Democratic Party, which had traditionally drawn support from both northern and southern states, became increasingly divided along sectional lines. The collapse of the Whig Party and the fragmentation of the Democratic Party reflected the deepening political crisis. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 was the final catalyst for the secession and the outbreak of the Civil War. Southern states viewed Lincoln's election as a direct threat to their way of life and economic interests. In response, several Southern states seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. The secession of Southern states and the formation of Confederacy were driven by the belief that the federal government, under Lincoln's leadership, would seek to abolish slavery and undermine the Southern economy. The secession crisis highlighted the deep and irreconcilable divisions within the United States. The firing on Fort Sumter in April 1861 marked the beginning of the Civil War. The conflict that followed was the bloodiest in American history, with profound consequences for the nation. The Civil War ultimately resolved the issue of slavery, leading to its abolition with the passage of the 13th Amendment. However, the war also left a legacy of regional animosity and social upheaval that would continue to shape American history. The antebellum era was a period of significant transformation in the United States, characterized by economic growth, social change, political tension, and cultural development. The expansion of the cotton economy and the entrenchment of slavery in the South contrasted sharply with the industrialization and urbanization of the North. These economic and social differences created deep divisions that were exacerbated by political conflicts over the issue of slavery. The rise of the abolitionist movement, the struggle for women's rights, and the impact of immigration and urbanization reflected broader social changes and challenges. The cultural developments of the era, from literature and art to religious revival and popular culture, provided a rich tapestry of American life. Ultimately, the growing divisions between the North and the South, driven by conflicting economic interests and moral values, led to the secession of Southern states and the outbreak of the Civil War. The antebellum era was a time of both great promise and profound conflict, setting the stage for the transformative events that would shape the future of the United States. It was at a time when America tried to rebuild itself from the ashes of a bitter war, a time when the ideals of freedom and equality were put to the ultimate test. This era, which stretched from 1865 to 1877, is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the depths of human cruelty. It is a period that must be understood, for it holds the key to understanding the American psyche and the long, painful road to justice and equality. The Civil War ended in 1865, leaving behind a country in ruins, both physically and morally. The Southern landscape was devastated, its cities and farms reduced to rubble. The economy was shattered, the old social order upended. In the North, there was jubilation over the victory and the end of slavery, but also a deep anxiety about what came next. The assassination of President Abraham Lincoln in April 1865 added to the national turmoil. Lincoln, with his vision of a malice toward none and a charity for all, was gone, leaving the nation in the hands of Andrew Johnson, a man ill-equipped to navigate the treacherous waters of Reconstruction. Johnson, a Southern Democrat who had remained loyal to the Union, was a complex figure. He despised the planter aristocracy, but held deeply racist views. His approach to Reconstruction was lenient toward the South, aiming to restore the old order without addressing the rights of the newly freed African Americans. This leniency emboldened the former Confederates, who sought to reassert their dominance through a system of black codes, laws designed to restrict the freedoms of African Americans and ensure their availability as a cheap labor force. The leniency of Johnson's policies sparked outrage among Northern Republicans, especially the radical Republicans who believed in a more profound transformation of Southern society. They sought not only to punish the South for its rebellion, but to ensure that the newly freed African Americans enjoyed full civil and political rights. In 1866, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which aimed to protect the rights of African Americans. Johnson vetoed the bill, but Congress overrode his veto, making a significant turning point. The radical Republicans regained control of Reconstruction, ushering in a period of more aggressive reforms. The Reconstruction Acts of 1867 divided the South into 5 military districts, each governed by a Union general. These acts required Southern states to draw new constitutions that guaranteed black men the right to vote. The presence of federal troops was meant to protect these rights and oversee the transition to a more equitable society. In 1868, the 14th Amendment was ratified, granting citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States and guaranteeing equal protection under the law. This amendment was a direct response to the Black Codes and aimed to enshrine the rights of African Americans in the Constitution. Make sure you hit that subscribe and share button. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Reconstruction era was the rise of African American political power. For the first time in American history, black men held public office at all levels of government. They served as mayors, sheriffs, state legislators, and even congressmen and senators. In South Carolina, a majority black state legislator was elected, reflecting the significant black population and their newfound political power. Figures like Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce became U.S. senators, representing Mississippi and challenging the deeply entrenched racism of American politics. These gains were met with fierce resistance from white Southerners, who could not accept the idea of black men wielding power. Organizations like the Ku Klux Klan emerged, using violence and intimidation to suppress black political participation and restore white supremacy. The Klan's terror campaigns were brutal, targeting not only black voters, but also their white allies. While political power offered some measure of progress, the economic reality for most African Americans remained dire. The promise of 40 acres and a mule, a dream of land ownership and economic independence, remained unfulfilled. Instead, the majority of freedmen found themselves trapped in a system of sharecropping. Sharecropping was a compromise of sorts, but it was a deeply exploitative system. Landowners provided the land, tools, and seeds, while the sharecroppers provided the labor. At the end of the season, the crop was divided between them. In theory, it offered a chance for self-sufficiency, but in practice, it often resulted in debt and poverty. The sharecropping system was rife with abuses. Landowners manipulated accounts, ensuring that sharecroppers remained in perpetual debt. The economic bondage was a stark reminder that freedom was not yet complete, and the struggle for economic justice continued. In 1870, the 15th Amendment was ratified, prohibiting states from denying the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This amendment aimed to protect the voting rights of African Americans, who had been under constant threat. Despite these constitutional protections, the implementation was fraught with challenges. White supremacists employed a variety of tactics to disenfranchise black voters, including literacy tests, poll taxes, and outright violence. The federal government, while initially committed to protecting these rights, gradually withdrew its support. The Compromise of 1877, which ended the contested presidential election of 1876, marked the end of Reconstruction. Federal troops were withdrawn from the South, leaving African Americans vulnerable to the resurgence of white supremacy. The promise of Reconstruction gave way to the harsh realities of Jim Crow, a system of racial segregation and disenfranchisement that will last for nearly a century. The Reconstruction era was also a time of significant cultural and social change. Freedmen and women sought to build new lives in a society that had long denied them basic human rights. They established schools, churches, and community organizations, laying the foundation for future generations. Education was a particularly powerful tool. Freedmen's schools, often funded by Northern missionary societies and the Freedmen's Bureau, sprang up across the South. These schools provided basic literacy and vocational training, empowering African Americans to pursue opportunities previously closed to them. Churches became central to African American communities, serving not only as places of worship, but also as centers of social and political life. The Black church played a crucial role in fostering a sense of identity and solidarity, offering support and leadership in the face of ongoing oppression. Women, both black and white, played crucial roles during Reconstruction, though their contributions are often overlooked. African American women, in particular, were at the forefront of community building and social change. They organized schools, established orphanages, and formed mutual aid societies to support those in need. Figures like Harriet Tubman continued their fight for justice, working tirelessly to aid freedmen and women. Black women also became politically active, advocating for their rights and the rights of their communities. They navigated a landscape of triple oppression, race, gender, and class. Yet, their resilience and leadership were pivotal in the progress made during this era. White women in the South faced their own set of challenges as they adjusted to the new social order. Some clung to the old ways, supporting the rise of white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Others, influenced by the ideals of the abolitionist movement, worked to aid the freedmen, though their efforts were often met with hostility from their communities. The Freedmen's Bureau, established in 1865, was a federal agency designed to assist freed slaves from the transition to freedom. It provided food, housing, medical aid, schooling, and legal assistance. The Bureau was instrumental in establishing schools and hospitals across the South, offering hope and resources to millions of newly freed individuals. However, the Bureau faced significant opposition and was chronically underfunded. Its efforts were hampered by the pervasive racism and hostility of Southern whites, who saw it as a threat to their dominance. Despite its limitations, the Freedmen's Bureau played a critical role in supporting African Americans during the early years of Reconstruction. The political landscape of Reconstruction was marked by intense social and rapid change. The radical Republicans pushed for sweeping reforms, while Southern Democrats sought to restore their pre-war social order. This political tug-of-war played out in state houses, Congress, and on the streets of Southern cities and towns. The impeachment of President Andrew Johnson in 1868 was a significant political event. Johnson's lenient policies toward the South and his frequent clashes with Congress led to his impeachment by the House of Representatives. Though he was acquitted by a single vote in the Senate, his presidency was severely weakened, paving the way for more radical Republican policies. The election of Ulysses S. Grant as president in 1868 brought a new leadership to the Reconstruction era. Grant, a war hero and staunch supporter of civil rights, worked to enforce Reconstruction policies and protect African Americans from violence. His administration, however, was marred by corruption scandals, undermining his effectiveness. Want good luck for the next 5 years? Share this video with 5 people. The rise of white supremacy during Reconstruction was a reaction to the social and political changes taking place. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan, the White League, and the Red Shirts used terror and violence to intimidate black voters and suppress African American political power. These groups were often supported by local authorities and enjoyed broad support among white Southerners. The federal government initially responded with force, passing the Enforcement Acts and the Ku Klux Klan Act to combat this violence. Federal troops were deployed to the South to protect African American voters and dismantle white supremacist organizations. However, as Northern support for Reconstruction waned, these efforts diminished and white supremacy regained its hold. The Compromise of 1877 marked the end of Reconstruction. The contested presidential election of 1876 between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel J. Tilden led to a political crisis. To resolve the impasse, a compromise was reached. Hayes would become president, and in return, federal troops would be withdrawn from the South. The withdrawal of federal troops left African Americans vulnerable to the reassertion of white supremacy. Southern states quickly enacted laws to disenfranchise black voters and enforce racial segregation. The gains of Reconstruction were rolled back, and the Jim Crow era began, institutionalizing racial discrimination for decades to come. The cultural impact of the Reconstruction era is profound. The struggles and achievements of African Americans during this period laid the foundation for future civil rights movements. The literature, music, and art of this era reflect the hopes, fears, and resilience of a people navigating a new and uncertain world. Spirituals and gospel music, rooted in the experiences of slavery and freedom, became powerful expressions of faith and resistance. Writers like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper and journalists like Ida B. Wells chronicled the challenges and triumphs of African Americans, their words resonating through the generations. The Black church emerged as a central institution in African American life, providing spiritual sustenance, community support, and leadership. It became a refuge and a rallying point, playing a critical role in the ongoing struggle for justice and equality. The legacy of Reconstruction cast a long shadow over American history. It was a period of significant progress and profound disappointment, a time when the nation came so close to realizing its ideals of freedom and equality, but ultimately fell short. The lessons of Reconstruction are both a warning and an inspiration. The era demonstrated the power of federal intervention to effect social change, but also the limits of that power in the face of entrenched resistance. It showed the importance of political will and the consequences of its absence. The failures of Reconstruction set the stage for the civil rights struggles of the 20th century, while its successes provided a foundation for future progress. The Reconstruction era is a reminder that the fight for justice is long and difficult, requiring vigilance and perseverance. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring hope for a better future. The story of Reconstruction is not just a chapter in American history, it is a continuing saga, a journey toward the fulfillment of the nation's highest ideals. The end of Reconstruction did not mean the end of the struggle for civil rights. African Americans continued to fight for their rights in the face of overwhelming odds. The seeds planted during Reconstruction would eventually bear fruit, as the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s took up the mantle of justice and equality. Figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Thurgood Marshall drew on the legacy of Reconstruction in their fight against Jim Crow. The legal battles waged by organizations like the NAACP built on the constitutional amendments of the Reconstruction era, challenging segregation and discrimination in the courts. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were victories that echoed the promises of Reconstruction, finally enshrining the rights that had been fought for a century earlier. The struggle continues today as America grapples with the legacies of its past and the challenges of its present. The Reconstruction era was a time of profound transformation and deep conflict. It was a period when America grappled with its identity and its future, a time when the ideals of freedom and equality were tested. The story of Reconstruction is a story of hope and betrayal, progress and regression, resilience and resistance. It is a story that must be remembered and understood, for it holds the keys to understanding the American journey. The lessons of Reconstruction remind us that the fight for justice is ongoing, and that the road to equality is long and arduous, but that progress is possible. It is a story that inspires us to continue the struggle, to believe in the possibility of a more just and equitable society. In the words of James Baldwin, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. The Reconstruction era challenges us to face our history, to confront the legacies of slavery and racism, and to work toward a future where the promises of freedom and equality are fully realized. The journey is far from over, but the spirit of Reconstruction, the spirit of hope and resilience, guides us forward. The legacy of the Reconstruction era is complex and contested. It was a time of significant progress and profound setbacks, a period when the nation grappled with the meaning of freedom and equality. The gains made during this era were real and lasting, but so were the losses. Reconstruction laid the groundwork for the civil rights movements of the 20th century. The constitutional amendments passed during this time, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, became the legal foundation for future struggles for equality. The Reconstruction era showed that progress was possible, even in the face of formidable opposition. Yet, the failure to fully realize the promise of Reconstruction left deep scars. The retreat from the ideals of this period allowed the rise of Jim Crow and the entrenchment of racial segregation. The dream of a multiracial democracy was deferred, but it was not forgotten. The story of Reconstruction is a story of resilience and resistance, of a people who refused to be defined by the chains that had bound them. It is a story that continues to resonate, reminding us of the ongoing struggle for justice and the enduring hope for a better future. The Reconstruction era is not just a political or economic story. It is a deeply humane one. It is about the men and women who, despite the odds, fought for their dignity and their rights. It is about the families who sought to reunite after the horrors of slavery, the children who attended school for the first time, and the communities that came together in the face of relentless adversity. Frederick Douglass, a towering figure of this era, captured the essence of the struggle when he said, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress." His words echo through the history of Reconstruction, a period marked by both immense struggle and significant progress. Throughout America's history, African Americans have faced brutal violence and debilitating legislation that continues to affect them to this very day. In this video, we will break down, like never before, the origins, the destruction, and the legacy of one of the most racist implementations in American history. The Jim Crow era, spanning from the late 19th century into the mid-20th century, represents a dark chapter in American history. It was a time when the promise of freedom and equality, as envisioned by the Reconstruction era, was systemically dismantled and replaced with a rigid and brutal system of racial segregation and discrimination. The Jim Crow laws were not just legal codes, but a societal mindset that sought to maintain white supremacy and ensure the subjugation of African Americans. The legacy of Jim Crow still resonates today, shaping the socio-political landscape of the United States. The term Jim Crow originated from a minstrel show character, a caricature of African Americans performed by white actors in blackface. This dehumanizing portrayal laid the foundation for a system that would institutionalize racism and segregation. At the end of Reconstruction in 1877, Southern states quickly moved to disenfranchise African Americans and reassert white dominance. The Compromise of 1877 which marked the end of federal intervention in southern states, allowed former Confederates to regain political power. This shift in power led to the enactment of laws and policies designed to strip African Americans of their newly acquired rights. The Supreme Court's decision in Plessy v. Ferguson cemented the legal basis for segregation, declaring that separate but equal facilities were constitutional. This ruling provided the legal justification for a wide array of discriminatory practices. The Compromise of 1877 stands as one of the darkest bargains in the annals of American history, a deal that delivered the presidency to Rutherford B. Hayes at the cost of sacrificing the hard-won freedoms of African Americans. This so-called compromise was less an agreement and more a cruel betrayal that heralded the end of the Reconstruction era and ushered in an age of oppression and despair. This compromise promised the withdrawal of federal troops from the South, support for Southern railroads, and political patronage, including a Southern Democrat in Hayes' cabinet. In essence, it was the sales of souls for power. With the withdrawal of federal troops, the fragile dreams of the Reconstruction era were shattered. The South, left to its own devices, quickly reverted to a regime of terror and oppression against Black Americans. This absence of federal oversight opened the floodgates of the enactment of Jim Crow laws. It was a betrayal that still echoes to this day. Jim Crow laws permeated every aspect of life in the South. Schools, public transportation, restrooms, restaurants, and even drinking fountains were segregated by law. African Americans were relegated to inferior facilities and services, reinforcing the notion of racial inferiority. The education system, in particular, was a tool of oppression, designed to limit the opportunities of Black children and maintain the racial hierarchy. The ratification of the 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including former slaves, and guaranteed equal protection of the laws to all citizens. In 1870, the 15th Amendment, which stated that voting rights could not be denied or abridged in the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. To work around that, voting rights during Jim Crow were systemically denied through mechanisms such as literacy tests, poll taxes, and the grandfather clause, which exempted white voters from these restrictions. These measures effectively disenfranchised African Americans, ensuring that political power remained in the hands of whites. The lack of political representation left African Americans vulnerable to exploitation and abuse without any recourse. The social norms of Jim Crow extended beyond the legal system. There was an unwritten code of conduct that dictated interactions between blacks and whites. African Americans were expected to show deference to whites, addressing them with titles of respect while being addressed by their first names or derogatory terms. Any perceived breach of these norms could result in violence, often in the form of lynching. Lynching was a particularly gruesome and public form of racial terror, used to enforce the social order of Jim Crow. Between the late 19th century and the early 20th century, thousands of African Americans were lynched across the South. These acts of violence were often carried out with impunity, as law enforcement either participated in or turned a blind eye to the brutality. Lynchings were public spectacles, designed to instill fear in the Black community. They were often advertised in advance, drawing large crowds of white spectators who would cheer on the brutality. Victims were tortured, mutilated, and hanged, their bodies left on display as a warning to others. The photographs of these atrocities, often turned into postcards, serve as a grim reminder of the depths of racial hatred. The fear of lynching permeated every aspect of Black life. It was a constant threat that influenced behavior, showing how African Americans navigated a hostile and dangerous world. The knowledge that a minor infraction or mere accusation could lead to death was a powerful tool of social control. The oppressive conditions of the Jim Crow South led to the Great Migration, a mass exodus of African Americans from the rural South to the urban North. Beginning around 1916 and continuing into the 1970s, millions of African Americans sought refuge in northern cities, hoping to escape the brutality of Jim Crow and find better economic opportunities. During the first Great Migration between 1916 and 1940, an estimated 1.6 million African Americans migrated north. The second Great Migration between 1941 and 1970 saw 5 million African Americans expanded west in search for improved living conditions to cities like Los Angeles, Oakland, and Chicago. The Great Migration had a profound impact on American society. Cities experienced significant demographic changes, leading to the growth of vibrant Black communities. Harlem in New York City, for example, became a cultural mecca, giving rise to the Harlem Renaissance, a flourishing of African American art, music, and literature. However, the North was not free from racism. African Americans faced segregation in housing, employment, and education. Racial tensions often erupted into violence, as seen in the Chicago Race Riot of 1919 and the Detroit Race Riot of 1943. Despite these challenges, the Great Migration offered African Americans a degree of autonomy and the opportunity to build new lives in a less oppressive environment. The injustices of the Jim Crow era laid the groundwork for the Civil Rights Movement. The movement, which gained momentum in the 1950s and 1960s, sought to dismantle the legal and social structures of segregation and discrimination. It was a struggle marked by perseverance, sacrifice, and a profound commitment to justice. The Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954 was a pivotal moment, declaring that separate but equal was inherently unequal and ordering the desegregation of public schools. This landmark ruling was met with fierce resistance in the South, where states employed a variety of tactics to delay and undermine desegregation. The Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 and 1956, sparked by Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat to a white passenger, demonstrated the power of nonviolent protest. Led by Martin Luther King Jr., the boycott galvanized the Black community and brought national attention to the struggle for civil rights. The movement faced significant oppression, both from the government and from private citizens. Activists were met with violence, arrests, and even assassination. The bravery of individuals who participated in sit-ins, freedom rides, and marches cannot be overstated. They faced physical harm and legal repercussions with courage and determination. The Civil Rights Movement achieved significant legislative victories and dismantled the legal framework of Jim Crow. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a comprehensive piece of legislation that prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It outlawed segregation in public places, provided for the integration of schools and other public facilities, and made employment discrimination illegal. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 addressed the disenfranchisement of African Americans. It banned literacy tests and other discriminatory practices that had been used to prevent Black people from voting. The act also provided for federal oversight of voter registration in areas with a history of discriminatory practices. The Fair Housing Act of 1968, passed in the aftermath of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, prohibited discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of housing. This act was crucial in the addressing of systemic segregation and economic disparities that had been perpetuated through discriminatory housing practices. The legacy of the Jim Crow era is deeply embedded in the fabric of American society. The systemic racism that was codified during this period had long-lasting effects on the socio-economic conditions of African Americans. The wealth gap, disparities in education, healthcare, and employment opportunities can all be traced back to the policies and practices of Jim Crow. The criminal justice system, in particular, bears the scars of this era. The over-policing of Black communities, racial profiling, and the disproportionate incarceration of African Americans are contemporary manifestations of the same racial control mechanisms used during Jim Crow. The war on drugs, mass incarceration, and police brutality are all part of this continuum. The psychological impact of Jim Crow cannot be overstated. The trauma of living under a system of constant oppression and dehumanization has been passed down through generations. The struggle for dignity and equality has left an indelible mark on the collective consciousness of African Americans. The history of the Jim Crow era is a testament to the resilience and strength of African Americans. Despite the relentless oppression, Black communities found ways to resist and thrive. Music, literature, and art became powerful forms of expression and resistance. The blues, jazz, and later hip-hop emerged from the Black experience, telling stories of pain, struggle, and hope. Writers like James Baldwin, Langston Hughes, and Zora Neale Hurston captured the complexities of Black life, challenging stereotypes and asserting the humanity of African Americans. The election of Barack Obama as the first African American president in 2008 was a historic moment, symbolizing progress and the potential for change. However, the backlash and the resurgence of overt racism in subsequent years have shown that the legacy of Jim Crow is still far from dead. The Black Lives Matter movement, which emerged in response to the killing of unarmed Black individuals by police, highlights the ongoing struggle against racial injustice. The protests, which have garnered international attention, are a continuation for the fight for civil rights, echoing the demands for justice and equality that were at the heart of the Civil Rights Movement. The disparities in healthcare, highlighted by the disproportionate impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on Black communities, further underscore the enduring effects of systemic racism. Access to quality health care, economic opportunities, and education are still heavily influenced by race, reflecting the long shadow of Jim Crow. Education is a critical battleground. Ensuring that all children have access to quality education is essential for breaking the cycle of poverty and inequality. The constant attack on African American studies, critical race theory, and affirmative action points to how pivotal it is to never forget the history of Jim Crow. The Jim Crow era is a stark reminder of the capacity for cruelty and injustice within a society. It is a period that reveals the depths of human prejudice, but also the heights of human resilience. The fight against Jim Crow was a fight for dignity, equality, and the very soul of America. Economic empowerment is another crucial area. Supporting Black-owned businesses, promoting fair employment practices, and addressing the wealth gap are necessary steps in creating economic justice. Access to affordable housing and equitable lending practices are also vital in building strong and resilient communities. The criminal justice system must be reformed to ensure that it serves all people fairly. Ending mass incarceration, addressing police brutality, and creating accountability mechanisms are essential for restoring trust and ensuring justice. The legacy of this era continues to shape the United States, influencing its politics, culture, and social structures. Understanding this history is essential for addressing the contemporary manifestations of racial injustice and for building a society that truly values equality and human dignity. In the words of James Baldwin, history is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history. The Jim Crow era is not just a chapter in the past, it is a part of the ongoing story of America. It is a story that demands to be told, remembered, and acted upon. The struggle for justice and equality continues, and the lessons of the Jim Crow era are as relevant today as they were then. The journey towards a more just and equitable society is long and fraught with challenges, but it is a journey that must be undertaken with courage, perseverance, and an unwavering commitment to the ideals of freedom and equality for all.